In the 2017 reimagining of Ash's start as a Pokemon trainer, there is a powerful scene that has always stuck with me. In this scene, we watch as Ash is possessed by Marshadow, corrupting Ash's thoughts and feelings as he projects his anger onto his Pokemon after losing a battle. It's unsettling to watch as Ash turns his back on Pikachu and walks away from his friends, venturing alone into the woods, even expressing his regret at not having chosen Bulbasaur or Squirtle as a starter.
If only my first Pokemon had been a Squirtle or Bulbasaur.
Eventually, he falls asleep and dreams of a nightmarish world where Pokemon didn't exist. And instead of going on adventures with his friends, he's stuck in the monotony of the real world, attending classes, and yearning for something more. As if to emphasize the depressing and isolated nature of this reality, the scene is rendered almost entirely in a grayscale, except for the fleeting memory of Pikachu that remains just out of Ash's reach. Eventually, Ash realizes his mistake and makes amends with his Pokemon, vowing to be a better trainer and to never take for granted their mutual friendship. It's at that point that Marshadow is expelled from Ash, and the Feather of Ho-Oh illuminates once more, symbolizing the restoration of Ash's heart. This scene hits hard, and every time I see it, I can't help but reflect on the metaphorical nature of this scene, and what better day to do that than today, Pokemon's anniversary. You see, to me, this scene is timeless. It's basically a modern-day retelling of A Christmas Carol, in which Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by a series of ghosts to show him the error of his ways before reforming himself and finding joy in sharing life with others. And I think that's an important concept that's incredibly relevant in the Pokemon community today. With so much money pouring into the hobby and the growing presence of scams and fraudulent activities, it's easy to get discouraged and forget why we're here. Like Ash, we run the risk of allowing outside forces to infiltrate our own hearts and minds, corrupting us and obscuring the things that matter most. I'm Pokemon Classics, and today I invite you to join me as we try to wrestle with this all too familiar question: is the Pokemon community toxic? But first, let's roll the intro. There's no doubt that the last few years have cast shadows over the landscape of Pokemon card collecting. We've certainly seen our share of social media drama, high-profile scams, Pokemon-related thefts, and a growing emphasis on money, sometimes coming at the expense of collectors and players. And while these trends may not be entirely new to the hobby, they have become more prevalent, leading some to conclude that the Pokemon community is toxic. Today, I want to explore this idea by examining 3 categories of people that exist in the Pokemon community and how their presence can affect the community as a whole. These categories include the scammers, the opportunists, and the drama makers. First, let's talk about the scammers. Every industry has its share of scams, which can come in a number of different forms. However, the one thing that all have in common is a willingness by a few bad actors to exploit others through intentional fraud and deception. Now, the thing about scammers is that they're actually an incredibly small population of the broader community, yet they often leave the biggest impact. And that's because their actions are inherently destructive, directly harming their victims, but also creating a ripple effect of fear and disgust throughout the broader community. Fear is, after all, a very powerful emotion, and nobody wants to get scammed, which is why so many of these situations draw mainstream attention. When it comes to Pokemon, most scams involve one of 3 things: deceiving others with resealed products, directly stealing cards or other merchandise, or intentionally misrepresenting items that are counterfeit, altered, or different than described. For example, you probably remember hearing about Logan Paul's resealed first edition booster case filled with G.I. Joe packs, or Punch-Out Gaming, which was robbed of its Pokemon inventory by a man in a ski mask. There was also a man arrested last year for using COVID relief money to purchase a BGS-graded Charizard, and too many counterfeit and altered card situations to even quantify. Unfortunately, if you participate in the hobby long enough, you're likely to be the target of a scam at some point. And just as unfortunate is the fact that many people will look to these individuals as a representation of the Pokemon community as a whole. However, these individuals are not representative of the hobby, and there are a number of safeguards to help alleviate one's susceptibility to scams. Personally, I'd suggest transacting with reputable sellers or stores and using platforms with buyer and seller protection policies built in. Although it's not perfect, many sites like eBay and PayPal offer buyer protection against fraudulent or misrepresented items and have even implemented authentication services to inspect higher value cards, verifying that both the seller and the buyer are safeguarded throughout the transaction. Scammers will always be a part of every community, particularly those with financial opportunity. However, don't let the Team Rocket thugs of the world contaminate your enjoyment and participation of the hobby. For every one shady individual out there, there are hundreds of respectable and morally upstanding friends just waiting to be met. Another interesting subset of people in the Pokemon community are the Opportunists. Now, I want to be careful not to open up Pandora's box and begin a debate about what a true collector is or isn't. In my opinion, such conversations often lead to unnecessary division and at least some level of gatekeeping within the hobby. However, I do think there are a number of individuals that have entered the hobby with the sole motivation of making money. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about collectors who also run a business, or Pokemon fans who happen to enjoy investing in cards and booster boxes, or even store owners who only carry inventories with the intent to sell them. All of those actions require at least some level of engagement and a long-term interest in Pokemon. Rather, I'm speaking specifically of those that migrate from one industry to another with little, if any, knowledge or passion for that industry, hoping to capitalize on its momentum. Like a Ditto, they transform themselves with the market, latching on to whatever happens to be hot, looking to profit by any means necessary, and eventually disappearing when the easy money runs out. Unlike scammers, these people aren't doing anything inherently wrong, but that doesn't mean that they don't adversely affect the community. During the peak of the Pokemon boom, for example, there were accounts of individuals buying out McDonald's entire supplies of Happy Meal packs, only to be immediately flipped online at significantly higher prices. And for the better part of 2020 and 2021, there was so much hoarding and scalping of modern product from big box retailers that access to cards was almost impossible without turning to the secondary market. Again, there is nothing illegal about retail arbitrage, and markets do have a way of self-correcting and stabilizing over time, but this singular issue negatively affected the experience and the perceptions of many collectors and players for a significant period of time. From stores rationing Pokemon products to polarizing debates on social media about who should or shouldn't have access to cards, this was an extremely contentious and divisive issue for many, and one of the leading reasons why so many people consider the community to be toxic. The ability to have civil discussions and empathize with others' feelings, rather than immediately resorting to an us versus them mentality of victimhood and gatekeeping, has unfortunately been the exception and not the norm. Personally, I don't fault people for seeing a financial opportunity and wanting to take advantage of it. However, it's always been my opinion that Pokemon's long-term interests are best served when cards remain relevant and accessible to younger generations. Perhaps it's my own background as a kid enjoying and experiencing Pokemon with my friends growing up, but it's those experiences that matter the most to me and what has kept me interested in Pokemon all these years later. And it's my hope that the younger generations get to share in those same experiences. I guess the point is that any thriving industry will experience its share of opportunists. It's really unavoidable, at least until the market cools off, but perhaps it's not their presence, but our response to them that determines whether or not a community is toxic. Like Ash, we can allow our anger to taint our hearts and then lash out at others, or we can reflect on ourselves and decide what we can do to better ourselves and our community around us. Finally, we have the drama makers, or those in the Pokemon space that have an obsession with controversy and calling out others for their perceived misdeeds or approaches to collecting. Now, this is a pretty diverse group of people, including those drawing legitimate attention to actual scams, those passing moral judgment on others after only assuming their motives, and those who inherently distort facts and take statements out of context to slander those that they simply don't like. But the tricky part is that these three forms of drama aren't always easy to distinguish for the viewer or even for the creator. Unfortunately, drama has become an increasingly prevalent form of entertainment in the Pokemon space and can prove quite lucrative to the influencers and channels who focus on this type of content. Now, I generally try to stay out of the various controversies and personal dramas that exist in this space, Some are quite petty and unproductive, and they almost always lead to unnecessary division within the community. However, when reflecting on the question, is the Pokemon community toxic? I think the normalization of infighting and the villainization of those we disagree with in the community is perhaps the greatest contributing factor to this perception. On the one hand, it propagates the us versus them mentality mentioned earlier, but it also redirects the attention and focus from all of the positive things our community has to offer, which is quite a bit, at least in my experience. We've seen Pokemon collectors and enthusiasts rally together to host social events, raise money for charity, mentor younger aspiring collectors, offer helpful resources and advice to the masses, and provide a sense of belonging to all those who feel connected to Pokemon in some way. Of course, there will always be some muck in the hobby, and it shouldn't be ignored, but I don't understand the point of allowing such negativity to consume us and define our entire experience. And that's a simple truth of life. Our experience is dictated not by the circumstances around us, but by the attitude we choose in spite of those circumstances. So perhaps the question, is the Pokemon community toxic, is best answered by looking inwardly at ourselves rather than outwardly at others. There's no denying that there are a number of toxic elements that exist within our community, but these elements only define our culture as much as we allow them to. And if those elements do bother you, simply don't feed into them. Or even better yet, find a way to actively promote the things you are passionate about. Those are the types of efforts that make the community a more vibrant and accepting place for everyone. In my opinion, the scammers, the opportunists, and drama makers are not representative of my experience as a collector or a creator here on YouTube. Like anyone, I've certainly received my share of criticism and insulting comments here on YouTube. I'm sure I'll get some on this video. And that's okay, because at the end of the day, the good that I've experienced in this community far outweighs the bad. The friendships I've made, the memories I've shared, and the experiences I've had are anything but toxic. Every year I rewatch I Choose You on Pokemon Day. I really should just buy it instead of renting it each time. But anyway, that nightmare sequence of Ash forgetting about Pikachu only gets more and more poignant with each viewing. It serves as a visual representation of the choice that we all face in our own lives. Do we allow our negative emotions to corrupt our hearts and blind us to the wonderful things in life that we often take for granted? Or do we awaken our hearts and choose to be the best versions of ourselves? I'm Pokemon Classics, and I thank you for joining me with this one. Let me know your thoughts on the subject down in the comments below. And of course, I hope you all had an amazing Pokemon Day. Until next time, everybody, don't forget to enjoy collecting and have fun. After all, that's why we're here. See you, everybody.